I've been a forest ranger for 14 months, and I need you to know something before I start. The rules on that paper, they weren't written for safety. They were written by someone who learned the hard way. Someone who didn't make it back the same way they went in. I found that out too late. Don't make my mistake. Listen carefully. I've been trying to figure out how to start this for about 3 weeks now. Every time I sit down to write it out, or record it, or just talk about it, I get maybe 5 minutes in and I have to stop. Not because I don't remember. I wish that were the problem. I stop because I remember everything. Every single detail. And the details are the part that breaks you. But I promised myself I'd get this out. For the people who are still going up there. For the rangers who are about to take the same posting I had and maybe, honestly, maybe just to hear myself say it out loud one more time. In the hope that it starts to feel less real. It won't. I know that now. But I keep hoping. My name doesn't matter. What matters is that for 14 months, I was a seasonal turned permanent ranger, assigned to the Kessler Ridge district of a national forest I am not going to name. I've been asked not to name it. I was asked very politely, in a room with no windows, by a man whose name I was never given. And when people like that ask you politely, you listen. What I can tell you is that it is in the Pacific Northwest. It is large. And if you've been hiking in that region in the last 5 years, there is a chance, a small but real chance, that you've been in my district without knowing it. I need you to think about that. Think about whether you heard anything strange after dark, whether your campfire felt wrong, whether you woke up at 3 in the morning and couldn't figure out why, and you lay there in your tent listening to the trees, and the trees were completely, perfectly silent. Not quiet, silent. There is a difference, and that difference is where this story lives. I want to take you back to the beginning, not to the night everything broke open. That comes later. And I need you to be prepared for it the way I wasn't. I need you to feel what I felt building for weeks before the worst of it. Because if I just told you the end, you'd think I was exaggerating. You'd think I was performing. And I have no interest in performing anymore. I got the Kessler Ridge posting in late April. I've been a seasonal ranger for 2 summers already, one in Colorado, one in Idaho. And when the permanent position opened up, I applied without much thought. It was a step up, better pay, a permanent station cabin, year-round work. My supervisor at the time, a woman named Doris, told me Kessler Ridge was a quiet district, not much visitor traffic, some logging history but mostly untouched old growth. She said I'd spend most of my time doing trail maintenance, monitoring the wildlife corridors, filing incident reports on nothing more exciting than a lost hiker or a campfire left burning. She wasn't lying. She just didn't know. I drove up in late April with a truck full of gear and about 4 years of institutional optimism that I no longer have. The access road into the station was 12 miles of unpaved forest road. Single lane, cut through Douglas fir so tall and dense that driving through felt like descending into water. The light changed, the temperature dropped. Even with the windows up, the air smelled different. That deep, wet, green smell that has no analog in human construction. Old, that is the word. It smelled old. The station itself was modest. Main cabin with a wood stove, a desk, a shortwave radio setup, a cot in a back room, generator for power, a separate storage shed, a truck bay. The previous ranger had left the place reasonably clean, though there were a few things I found odd at the time that I now understand completely. He'd put a lock on the outside of the storage shed, not on the inside. The outside, and above the desk, there was a piece of paper tacked to the wall. Not a formal document, just a regular sheet of printer paper with typed text. I thought at first it was a checklist or a maintenance schedule. It wasn't. I'll come back to it. I need to come back to it because everything hinges on that piece of paper. The first 2 months were exactly what Doris described. Quiet. I maintained trails, did wildlife spot surveys, logged bear activity east of the ridge, Cleared a half-mile of overgrown path near a trailhead that hadn't seen maintenance in 2 seasons. I saw day hikers on weekends. Occasionally, a backpacker or two. I issued 1 citation for an illegal campfire and helped a family of 4 find their way back to the trailhead after they'd lost the path. Normal work. Good work. I liked it. I want to be clear about that, because what comes later might make it seem like I was always uncomfortable there. And that is not true. For the first couple of months, I genuinely loved Kessler Ridge. The solitude suited me. I've always been that way. More comfortable in silence than in noise. More at ease alone than in crowds. My ex-wife would tell you that was always the problem. And she is not wrong. But it made me suited to that kind of work in a way that not everyone is. Up at 5:30, log the overnight weather, eat something, head out on the East Loop by 6:30. Back to station by early afternoon. Paperwork, radio check-ins with the district supervisor. Equipment maintenance. In the evening I'd eat, read, sometimes listen to the radio. I was in bed by 9:30, 9 most nights, because being in the field all day in mountain terrain is physically exhausting in a way that your body just demands sleep. I slept well, those first 2 months. I want you to remember that part too. I slept well. The first thing I noticed, and I know now that it was the beginning, even though it seemed like nothing, was a sound. It was a Tuesday evening in late June. I'd come back from a long loop that had taken me up to the northern boundary of the district, a stretch of old growth I'd been surveying for a forestry report. I was tired, more than usual. I'd been on my feet for nearly 9 hours. I ate, cleaned up, and was sitting on the station porch in the last of the evening light. Maybe 8:15, 8:30. Just sitting there with a cup of coffee going cold in my hands. The forest at that hour makes a lot of sound. Wind in the canopy, birds doing their last calls before dark, thrushes, varied thrushes mostly, that strange reedy tone they have, squirrels and other small mammals settling for the night. The creek about a quarter mile down the slope, always audible if the wind wasn't strong. I know the sound of that forest. That is important. After 2 months of living inside it, your brain develops a map of the ambient audio. You know what belongs there and what doesn't. Not consciously. You don't sit there cataloging it. But some older part of your brain does, constantly, and when something doesn't fit, it flags it. Something flagged. A sound, low, rhythmic, almost exactly on the edge of hearing. I thought at first it was the generator. Sometimes it threw a harmonic at certain RPMs, but the generator was off. I'd shut it down an hour earlier. I thought maybe it was a grouse, doing that low chest drumming they do during mating season. But mating season was long past, and it wasn't quite the right sound for that anyway. It was more tonal, almost melodic in a way I didn't like. It lasted maybe 40 seconds, and it stopped. I sat there for another 10 minutes waiting for it to come back, and it didn't. I went inside. I wrote it in my field log as unidentified low vocalization, possible large bird or mammal. I underlined possible. Then I went to bed. I slept fine that night. But here is the thing about the first time you hear it. You don't know it is the first time. You have no context for it. There is no alarm going off in your head saying this is the beginning of something. It is just a sound in the woods. It is just your first night that ends with a question mark instead of a period. The question mark doesn't feel significant yet. It will. The second time was a week later. Same time of evening, roughly. I was inside the cabin this time, sitting at the desk doing paperwork. The window next to the desk was open about 6 inches, because the evening was warm and the cabin got stuffy. The sound came through the open window. Same quality, low, rhythmic, tonal. But this time it was closer. Not dramatically close, maybe 50 yards instead of 200. And it lasted longer, almost 2 minutes. I pushed back from the desk and went to the window and stood there listening, and the hair on my arms was up and I couldn't fully account for why. It stopped again. Clean stop, mid-breath if it had breath. Not fading out the way an animal call does when a creature moves away. Just off, like a switch. I picked up the flashlight and went outside. I walked to the edge of the clearing the station, sat in and stood at the tree line and listened. Nothing. The normal sounds. Wind. Thrush. Creak. I went back inside and wrote it in the log. Same description, with an addendum, duration approximately 2 minutes, apparent origin point approximately 50 yards northeast, no source identified on investigation. I was already starting to feel something I'd describe as anticipatory. Not fear exactly, more like the feeling you get in the seconds before your phone rings when you somehow already know it is going to ring. Like the sound was creating an expectation in me that I didn't fully understand yet. I read an extra hour before I slept that night. I told myself I was just unwinding. I wasn't. I was staying awake. There is a difference. It came every 2 to 3 nights for the next month. Not always at the same time. Not always from the same direction. Sometimes I was outside when it happened. Sometimes inside. Once it woke me at 1 in the morning, and I lay in the dark listening to it come through the thin cabin walls. And that was the first time I felt what I'd call genuine unease. Not fear. Not yet. But the kind of unease that fills your chest and makes it hard to breathe normally. I tried to find it. 4 times in that month I went out with a flashlight. Then with a stronger spotlight I pulled out of the equipment shed and walked toward the sound. Every single time it stopped before I could get close enough to identify a source. Once I found fresh deer tracks in the soft earth near the creek, which told me nothing useful. Once I found a broken branch about 7 feet off the ground that I couldn't explain. Not broken at the base, broken midshaft, like something had grabbed it and pulled. White wood exposed inside the break. Fresh, within the last day or 2 at most. I stood there under that broken branch in the dark with my spotlight, looking up at it. And I had the clearest, most specific feeling that I was being watched. Not a vague sense of presence, a specific directional feeling, the unmistakable sense that eyes were on me from somewhere in the dark ahead, and that those eyes were waiting to see what I would do. I turned around and walked back to the station. Not running. I want to be honest about that. I didn't run, but I walked at a pace that was closer to running than I'd care to admit, and when I got back inside and closed the cabin door, I stood with my back against it for a full minute just listening. Nothing. That was the end of July. Now, I have to tell you about the paper. I mentioned it at the beginning. The piece of paper that was tacked above the desk when I arrived. I'd read it once when I first moved in, thought it was some informal note from the previous ranger. Maybe procedural things not covered in the official handbook, and filed it mentally as low priority. I went back to it on the 1st of August. I don't know exactly what prompted me to reread it. Maybe the accumulation of the sounds over the previous month. Maybe the broken branch. Maybe just some subconscious process making connections I wasn't consciously making yet. Whatever it was, I found myself at the desk on a rainy afternoon, pulling out that thumbtack sheet, smoothing it on the desktop, and reading it carefully for the first time. It was a list. 12 items, no header, no name, no date. I'm going to tell you what was on it. I'm going to try to be as accurate as possible, because I've been over it in my head so many times that I've second-guessed my own memory of it. But I think I have it right. I'll put it in the right order. 1. Do not go past the east boundary markers, after dark under any circumstances. 2. If you hear a low rhythmic sound during evening hours, go inside immediately and close all windows. 3. Do not respond to sounds that approximate your name or voice in the forest. 4. The storage shed is locked from the outside. Do not move or remove the lock. If your radio produces static on the district frequency between 11 p.m. and 4 a.m., do not transmit. 6. Do not follow any human-shaped silhouette you observe at the tree line after dark, regardless of apparent distress. If a visitor describes an encounter with an unusually tall figure in the forest, file the standard incident report, note the time and location, and do not investigate that location alone. 8. Do not leave food or water outside the cabin after dark. 9. If you wake and the forest is completely silent, do not go outside until morning. 10. There will be nights when the trees creak even with no wind. This is normal. Do not investigate. 11. Do not attempt to record the sound. 12. The most important rule. The boundary markers on the East Trail, at the third switchback, include one that is painted red. Do not go past the red marker. Not at night. Not during the day. I sat with that list for a long time, my first reaction. And I am not proud of it now. But I am going to be honest. My first reaction was something between amusement and irritation. This felt like either a hazing document left by a ranger with a dark sense of humor, or some kind of unofficial folklore that had accumulated around the district over years of isolated posting. Forest rangers develop their superstitions. Every remote posting has its stories. I'd heard plenty in Colorado and Idaho. But I read it a second time, and a third, and some of the amusement started to drain away, because 3 items on that list described things I had already experienced. Item 2. A low rhythmic sound. I'd been hearing it for over a month. The instructions said go inside immediately and close all windows. I had been doing the opposite. Going outside to investigate. Item 11. Do not attempt to record the sound. I had tried once, 3 weeks earlier, with the voice memo function on my phone. The recording had come out as nothing but static and a low hum that didn't match what I'd heard. I'd assumed my phone's microphone just wasn't sensitive enough. Item 11 made me think about that differently. Item 9. If you wake and the forest is completely silent, do not go outside until morning. I had woken twice in the previous month to silence. Complete, wrong silence. And I had not gone outside. Not because of any instruction, because of instinct. Item 9 made my stomach drop when I reread it, because it meant that whatever I had been instinctively afraid of in those moments was real enough to warrant a written rule. I pinned the list back to the wall. I sat there for a while. Outside, the rain came down steady on the cabin roof. Then I picked up the radio handset and called the district supervisor, a man named Terrence who operated out of the main station 40 miles south. I asked him, as casually as I could manage, whether he had any information on previous incidents in the Kessler Ridge district. Unusual incidents. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, in an entirely normal tone, that nothing notable was in any file he had access to, and that Kessler Ridge had always been a quiet posting. I asked if he knew the previous ranger personally. He said he'd met him a few times. I asked why the ranger had left. Another pause. He said the position had been reclassified, and the previous occupant had transferred. I asked where to. He said he didn't have that information. I thanked him and signed off. He had answered every question, and somehow every answer had told me nothing that bothered me more than silence would have. I found the east boundary markers the next morning. I knew the East Trail, of course. I'd walked it dozens of times. The boundary markers were standard, square posts with orange paint, positioned at the legal district boundary. I'd never paid them special attention. The third switchback was about 2 miles in. I'd been past it many times without noticing anything unusual about the markers there. But when I went back looking, I found it immediately. One post, about 12 inches taller than the others. The orange paint had been painted over, not recently. The red was faded and weather-worn, with red, solid red, no other markings. It stood at the edge of the switchback where the trail curved sharply north. On the other side of it, the trail continued. I could see it clearly, another 40-50 yards of visible path before it curved into the trees. I stood on my side of the red marker and looked at the continuing trail. There was nothing visually different about what was beyond it. Same forest, same dense fir and hemlock, same damp leaf litter, same filtered gray light coming through the canopy, a few old-growth cedars visible farther in, massive trunks you could hollow out and live inside. I did not go past the marker. I want to make that clear. That day, I read the instruction. I found the marker, and I turned around and walked back to the station. But I stood there for several minutes looking at what was beyond it, and during those several minutes, standing completely still in the silence of the forest, I had the clearest, most unambiguous sense I have ever had in my life that something on the other side of that marker was looking back at me. I turned around and walked back. August progressed. I followed the list. I followed all of it. The way I should have from the beginning. I went inside. I closed the windows. I did not transmit on the radio during the specified hours. I kept food and water inside after dark. The frequency of the sound increased. In the first month, it came every 2 to 3 nights. In August, it came almost every night. Still after dark. Still that same low, tonal, rhythmic quality. Still cutting off clean. On the nights the sound came, the ambient forest noise, the insects, the birds, the small mammal movement, went quiet about 10 to 15 minutes beforehand. The way prey animals go silent when a predator is nearby. And it would stay quiet until about 20 minutes after the sound stopped, and then gradually, tentatively, resume. Something in that forest was afraid of the thing making that sound. Something in that forest knew to go quiet when it was present. I am an animal. I have a nervous system. Whatever was triggering those flight responses in every living thing in the forest around me was triggering the same response in me, whether I wanted it to or not. I would feel it like a physical thing, a cold tightening in my chest, a heightening of every sense, an acute awareness of the exact distance between me and every door and window in the cabin. I started sleeping with the wood stove lit. Even in August, not for warmth, for light. The district supervisor called for a routine check-in on a Thursday afternoon in mid-August. Completely routine. He asked how the surveys were going. I asked again, more directly this time, whether there were any active research projects or wildlife studies happening in the eastern section of my district. He said no. I asked if there was any history of unusual activity in that area. He said he didn't know what I meant by unusual. I said unusual. He told me to file a report if I observed anything that warranted documentation. He signed off. That night, sitting at the desk, I wrote a full account in my personal notebook. Not the official field log, everything from the first sound in late June to the list on the wall to the red boundary marker. I wrote it out in detail, dated it, and put the notebook in my truck under the driver's seat. If something happened to me at the station, someone might eventually find the truck. Someone might look under the seat. I wasn't being paranoid. I was being practical. There is a difference, and the fact that I felt the need to make that distinction, sitting alone at my desk in a cabin in the mountains at night, tells you something about where my head was. 14 days into August, a hiker came in off the East Trail. She was a solo backpacker, a woman in her mid-40s, experienced by her gear and demeanor. She'd come in from the main trailhead and had been out for 3 days. She stopped at the station to refill her water at the spigot outside, and we exchanged the usual pleasantries. She said the trail was in good shape. She asked about the weather forecast for the next 2 days. I gave her what I had. Then she asked, in the way people ask when they've been slightly bothered by something, but don't want to seem dramatic, whether there was any large wildlife in the eastern section of the district. I asked why. She said she'd seen something the evening before. Around dusk, she'd been about 1.5 miles from the east boundary, setting up camp. She'd seen. She paused here, seemed to be choosing her words. A figure, standing at the edge of the clearing where she was camping. Very tall. Taller than a person should be, she said, just standing there. She'd thought at first it was another hiker, but it was too still, and it was too tall, and after a few minutes she'd gone to unzip her tent, and when she looked back, it was gone. She described it as wrong-shaped. Not dramatically wrong, just proportions that weren't quite right, too long in certain places. I wrote it down. I told her it was likely a shadow play from the low evening light in the tree line. I told her elk were common in the district and could look very large and human-shaped from a distance in low light. I told her to have a safe hike out. She thanked me and left. I watched her walk out to the parking area, get in her car, drive away. And then I went inside and found the paper on the wall and read item 6 again. Do not follow any human-shaped silhouette you observe at the tree line after dark, regardless of apparent distress. And item 7. If a visitor describes an encounter with an unusually tall figure in the forest, file the standard incident report. Note the time and location, and do not investigate that location alone. I filed the standard incident report. I noted the time and location. I did not investigate. But I stayed up until almost midnight that night, sitting at the desk with all the lights on, reading that piece of paper, over and over, given to me by a predecessor I'd never met, about situations I'd never been briefed on, in a district I'd been told was quiet. I called my contact at the regional forestry office the next morning. I asked, very specifically, whether there were any classified research installations or wildlife research programs east of the district boundary at Kessler Ridge. The contact, a woman I'd spoken with a dozen times and trusted, said she'd check and call me back. She called back 4 hours later. She said she'd found a reference in the archival district files to a long-term environmental monitoring study established in that area in 1987. She said the file was thin and mostly administrative. She said the contact organization listed was a university department that she'd looked up, and that the department no longer existed, had been closed in 1994 as part of a budget reorganization. She said she didn't know what the study involved. I thanked her. Established in 1987, running through at least 1994, possibly longer. Whatever was out there past that red marker had been there for at least 30 years before I arrived, possibly longer, possibly much longer. The last week of August, I had been at the station for 4 months. In that time, I had developed a very specific relationship with the eastern section of the district. I knew where not to go and when. I knew what sounds to listen for. I had developed, without intending to, a working behavioral model of something I could not name, based entirely on observation from a safe distance. It moved at night, primarily, though not exclusively. The hiker had seen it at dusk, and I had my own dusk observations by that point that I'll get to. It was drawn to sound, human voice, mechanical noise. I had noticed that on the nights I used the generator after dark, the sound came sooner and closer than on nights I used battery power only. It appeared to communicate or signal at regular intervals, the rhythmic, tonal sound, in a pattern that suggested either territorial behavior or something I couldn't categorize with any framework I had. It was large, larger than a person. Larger, I suspected, than anything that should be living in a Pacific Northwest forest. And it was patient. That was the part that frightened me most. Not the sound, not the proximity, not the wrong-shaped figure at the tree line. The patience, because patience implies planning. Patience implies a kind of awareness that goes beyond animal instinct. Whatever was out there was not reacting to me blindly. It was watching me, assessing me, learning my patterns the same way I was learning its. I had been there 4 months. It had had 4 months to study me. On the 23rd of August, I found tracks. I had taken the East Trail on routine maintenance, replacing a washed-out section of drainage dip, standard work. And on the way back, about 3/4 of a mile west of the red marker, I found them in a patch of soft, wet earth near a creek crossing. I crouched over them for a long time. They were bipedal, 2-footed, upright gait. That much was clear from the pattern and spacing. The stride length was long, very long, maybe 45 to 50 inches between footfalls, which would suggest a height well over 7 feet, just from biomechanics. The impressions were deep, which meant significant weight. The shape was wrong. Not a bear print. I know bear prints, both black and grisly, and this wasn't either. Not a human print, though it had the general structure of one heel, arch, toe zone. But the toe impressions were longer and more widely spaced, and there were 5 clear toe marks, with what looked like a 6th partial impression at the outer edge of each. I photographed them. I measured them. I wrote measurements and description in my notebook. The freshest looking prints were pointing toward the station. September. The nights got longer. In a Pacific Northwest forest, The change from August to September is dramatic, not in temperature necessarily, but in light. The days shortened fast. By mid-September it was dark before 7:30. The window between sunset and the time I needed to be inside, behind closed windows, with the lights on. That window was narrowing. I had 3 incidents in September that I need to describe carefully, because they mark the transition between observation and direct engagement. Before September, whatever was out there had been a presence I was aware of. In September, it became aware that I was aware of it. And that change, that moment when the thing watching you realizes you've seen it, changes everything. First incident, the 4th of September. I was on the porch in the late afternoon, still full daylight, 5 p.m., plenty of light left. I had a cup of coffee, and I was reviewing trail notes. The sound came. For the first time, it came during the day. I went inside, as the list instructed. But this felt different. This felt like a violation of the pattern I built my safety model around. It had always come after dark. Always, the pattern was reliable and I had built my behavior around it. Day meant safe, night meant inside. If it could come during the day, then nothing was where I'd put it. The sound lasted 4 minutes. When it stopped, I went back to the window and looked out at the clearing. At the western tree line, the opposite side from where I'd heard the sound originate. There was something standing in the shadow under the trees. I couldn't see it clearly. The light was wrong. The sun was getting low and throwing long shadows into the forest edge, but there was a shape there. Tall still. Dark. I stepped back from the window. I stood in the middle of the cabin, and I did not move for a long time. When I finally went back to the window, it was gone. Second incident, the 11th of September. I woke at 2:17 in the morning by the clock on my phone. No alarm, no sound. I lay there in the dark trying to understand what had woken me, and after a moment I understood. Silence. Complete silence. The creek. Inaudible. The wind. Nothing. Insects. None. The whole ambient noise field of the forest, the constant low hum of life that I've become so accustomed to, I only noticed it in its absence. Gone. Item 9. If you wake and the forest is completely silent, do not go outside until morning. I lay in the cot and I did not move. I kept my breathing slow. I kept my eyes on the ceiling. I did not look at the windows. The silence lasted. I'm going to say this number, and I need you to understand it is accurate, because I watched the clock the whole time. The silence lasted 2 hours and 40 minutes. The ambient sounds began returning at 5 in the morning. First one insect, then the creek, faintly, and more insects, then a bird. Like the forest was rebooting, one organism at a time. When it was fully light, I went outside with the largest flashlight I owned. I checked the perimeter of the clearing. I found footprints in the soft earth at the north edge. The same long stride. The same wrong toe configuration. They made a circuit of the cabin, all the way around. The prints overlapped in places, suggesting multiple passes, not just one transit. Whatever had made them had walked around the cabin, repeatedly, for some portion of that 2 hours and 40 minutes, maybe all of it. The closest prints were 4 feet from the cabin wall. Third incident, the 18th of September. I want to be careful with how I tell this one, because this is where it gets difficult to describe without it sounding like something I invented. I was at the desk at 8 in the evening. The generator was off. I was using a battery lantern. The radio was on, the district frequency, low volume, not because I expected anything, but because the human voice coming out of it, even just the occasional check-in from dispatch, was company of a kind I needed by that point. The radio produced static, not the static of a bad signal, a different quality. Lower frequency, rhythmic, like the sound, but coming out of the radio. I sat very still. It lasted about 20 seconds. Then the normal quiet static resumed. Item 5. If your radio produces static on the district frequency between 11 p.m. and 4 a.m., do not transmit. It was 8 p.m., not in the specified window. The rule said 11 to 4. But the feeling in my chest when that static came through the radio, that cold, specific feeling, it was the same feeling. I sat there, and I did not transmit. And then, from outside the cabin, from the direction of the northeast tree line, the sound came. In the same rhythm as the radio static, the same pattern. It was responding, or transmitting, or, and this is the thing that has kept me awake more nights than I can count, it was demonstrating that it knew I was listening to the radio. It was telling me it could reach me there too. October, I had requested a mid-season check-in meeting with the district supervisor. I drove the 12 miles out to the main road, then 40 miles south to the district station, and I sat across from Terrence in his office, and I told him about the sounds. I told him about the tracks. I told him about the hiker's report, which was in the official incident file. I told him about the radio. I did not tell him about the list. I'm not sure why. Some instinct told me that showing him the list would change something. Either he would know about it and deny it, or he wouldn't know about it, and it would open questions I wasn't ready to have answered out loud in an office. He listened. He was attentive. He didn't dismiss me. He took notes. And then he told me, carefully, that in this district, and in this region, there were a number of wildlife species whose behavior was not well understood, and that my observations were consistent with animal activity that had been documented, if sparsely, in other remote postings in the Pacific Northwest. He told me the protocol was to document and report, and that if I felt the situation warranted escalation, I could request a wildlife specialist come up for a consultation. I asked him to arrange that. He said he'd see what he could do. I drove back to the station. The wildlife specialist never came. Terrence called twice over the following month to tell me it was being arranged. It was never arranged. I stopped asking. By late October, I had developed what I can only describe as a survival routine. I was inside by dark. Hard stop. Generator off by 9. Radio off by 10:30. All windows shut and latched regardless of temperature. I slept with a hunting knife under my pillow. I had started carrying it in the field in early October. And with the battery lantern on low, I know how this sounds. I know what it sounds like from the outside. Reading this as a story. It sounds like a person coming unraveled in isolation. I know that. I thought it myself many times. I called my sister in November and tried to describe what I was experiencing, and she asked, very gently, whether I was getting enough sleep, whether I'd considered talking to someone, whether the isolation might be getting to me. It was getting to me. That part was true. But isolation doesn't make prints around your cabin. Isolation doesn't produce static in a pattern that matches the sound coming from the forest. Isolation doesn't write a list of rules pinned above your desk. November. This is where the story changes. I've been building toward this. I've been telling you about the accumulation, the sounds, the tracks, the sightings, the rules, because you need to feel the weight of it the way I did. 14 months of the thing I've been describing to you, and I want you to understand that by November, I had normalized it. That is what humans do. We normalize because normalization is survival. The brain cannot sustain high alert indefinitely. So it builds a model, and within the model, certain things become routine, and routine is manageable. I had a routine inside by dark. Radio off, no generator after 9. Don't follow anything at the tree line. Don't respond to sounds that might be your name. Don't investigate. On the 3rd of November, I broke a rule. Not deliberately, or not fully deliberately. Let me explain. I had been having trouble sleeping. 2 weeks of broken nights, waking at odd hours, lying in the dark listening. The silence episodes had become more frequent, 3 times in October, twice in the first days of November. On the night of the 3rd, I fell asleep early around 8:30, and I slept without interruption until something woke me. Not silence. Sound. Human sound. A voice, somewhere outside the cabin. In the dark, a voice was calling. I sat up. My whole body was rigid. The voice was calling. I need to be careful about how I describe this. It was calling words that approximated my name. Not quite. like the way a voice sounds through a wall or underwater. The right syllables, the right length and stress pattern, but slightly wrong. Like an impression of my name, not my name itself. Item 3. Do not respond to sounds that approximate your name or voice in the forest. I sat in the dark of the back room and I listened. The voice called again. Same quality. Same approximation. And here's the thing I have gone back to again and again, because this is where I failed. This is the thing I did wrong. It sounded like a person in distress. That is the best way I can describe it. Not just the sound of my name being called, but the quality of distress in the voice, the urgency. And I am a forest ranger. The fundamental, bedrock orientation of my work is toward helping people who are lost or hurt in the wilderness. That orientation runs deep. It runs below reason. I got up. I put on my boots and my jacket. I picked up the hunting knife and the large flashlight, and I went to the front door of the cabin and opened it. I stood in the doorway and I did not step outside. That much I held to. I stood in the doorway and I pointed the flashlight toward the northeast tree line, toward the origin of the voice, and I swept it slowly across the edge of the clearing. The light caught something. At the far edge of the clearing, at the tree line, there was a figure standing. It was in the trees, not in the clearing, just barely into the shadow of the fir trees, positioned so that the flashlight caught the edge of it. The margin. I could see enough. It was tall. 7 feet, maybe more. Thin, very thin. The proportions were wrong in the way the hiker had described, too long in certain places. It was dark. Not dark-clothed, dark-skinned, or furred. I couldn't tell. And it was completely perfectly still. Its head, and I say head because there was a head-shaped structure at the top of it, was turned toward me. I did not move. Neither did him. I stood in the doorway for, I don't know, maybe 30 seconds, maybe a minute. Time had gone strange in the way it does in those moments when your body is operating on pure adrenaline, and your brain has temporarily stopped processing non-survival information. Then it moved. 1 step forward, out of the trees, into the margin of the flashlight's full beam. I stepped back inside and I slammed the door. I shot the bolt, both bolts. I went to the desk and I pushed the desk against the door. I went to the storage closet and I got the large battery lantern and turned it on maximum brightness and put it in the center of the cabin floor. I went to the window and I shook the latch 3 times to make sure it was fastened. Then I stood in the middle of the bright cabin and I waited. No sound for 20 minutes. Then the low tonal sound began. From very close. I would say within 30 yards of the cabin. It lasted approximately 10 minutes. It stopped. Then silence. For 4 hours. I did not sleep. When it was light, I went to the northeast tree line. I found prints at the edge of the clearing. The closest ones were 8 feet from the tree line. In the clearing itself, that was new. In all the months of mourning, after investigations, the prints had always been at the edge, or just within the tree line. They had never been in the open clearing before. It had come into the clearing. It had stood in the open, in the full beam of my flashlight, and let me see it. That was a choice. Something had made a choice. I called the district supervisor the next morning, and I told him I needed to file a formal report of direct wildlife encounter. He said he'd send a form. I asked if anyone could come to the station. He said it was a 2-hour drive in bad weather. And what was the nature of the emergency? I told him I had an unidentified large animal making incursions into the station clearing at night, and that I was concerned for my safety. He told me to discharge an air horn if I felt threatened, and that he'd look into arranging a site visit. That night, the sound came at 9:15, full dark, from the west tree line. Closed the windows. I sat at the desk with the lantern on and I read the list on the wall. 12 items. 12 things I had now verified against personal experience. Every single one of them. I made a decision. I was going to find out what I was dealing with. I want to be clear that I know this was the wrong decision. The list existed because someone before me had worked out, through whatever experience, that engagement was the wrong move. Everything about the rules pointed toward avoidance. Stay inside, don't follow, don't respond, don't cross the red marker. But I'd been in that cabin for 7 months. I was sleeping with a knife. I was waking up to something circling my home at night. I was watching my rationality erode. Not because I was going crazy, but because the sustained weight of unexplained fear, night after night, without resolution, without information, without anyone who could actually help me. It was becoming untenable. I needed to know what I was dealing with. Over the following week, I made a plan. I wanted to get past the red marker in daylight with full preparation and with a time limit. I would go in no more than a quarter mile past the marker. I would observe and document, and I would be back on the safe side of the marker, well before dark. I would carry the hunting knife, a bear spray canister, and my radio, knowing now that the radio could be interfered with, but having no better option. I would tell no one, because telling anyone had produced nothing but worry in forms that were never sent. The night before I planned to go, I sat at the desk for a long time. I reread the list. I thought about item 12, the most important rule. Do not go past the red marker, not at night, not during the day, not for any reason. I folded the thought away. I told myself that the rule was written by someone operating with incomplete information, or who was more cautious than the situation required, or who had other reasons for establishing the boundary that weren't about safety. I told myself a lot of things. November 14th, clear and cold. I was at the red marker by 8 in the morning with 4 hours of good light ahead of me. I stood on the safe side of the marker for maybe 5 minutes. I looked at the trail continuing east. I listened. Bird calls, wind in the canopy, the distant creek. Normal. Everything normal. I stepped past the marker. The first 100 yards were unremarkable. Same forest, same density, same composition of fir and cedar and hemlock. The trail was clear, narrow but maintained, which surprised me. I had expected something overgrown and untended. Instead, the path was clear of debris, the brush on either side cut back, the drainage working the way a maintained trail's drainage should work. Someone known had been maintaining this trail. Someone was still maintaining it. The second 100 yards. The trail curved northeast, and the canopy thickened. The light dropped. Even in full mid-morning sun, this part of the forest was dark, old growth so dense that the light arrived as a kind of twilight, greenish and still. The temperature dropped too, not dramatically, but perceptibly. I had the acute awareness that I was being watched. I stopped walking and stood completely still. I turned slowly, checking the trees on both sides of the trail. Nothing visible, no movement, no sound that didn't belong. I kept walking. Quarter mile in, the trail opened into a small clearing. I stepped into it and stopped. In the center of the clearing was a structure. I want to find the right words for this. It was approximately 10 feet tall, built from timber, raw, uncut timber, like large branches stripped of bark, lashed together with what looked like cord or root. The structure was roughly conical, like a very large tripod or a primitive shelter frame. It was old. The wood had weathered to gray, some of it beginning to decompose at the base. But at the top, and at several points along the upper frame, there were additions that were not old. Bright white cord, modern cord, synthetic, lashing newer, lighter colored wood to the old structure. Recent additions, recent maintenance, on the ground around the base of the structure, arranged in a rough circle, were objects. I walked slowly around the outside of the circle and I looked at each of them. I did not touch anything. Animal bones. Large ones. Deer, I thought. Possibly elk. Arranged in groups, not scattered. The pattern was too regular to be random. Several small objects that I can only describe as bundles. Sticks and plant material tied together with the same white cord I'd seen on the structure. 3 rocks painted with the same red paint as the boundary marker. And something I had to crouch over and look at closely to identify. A ranger badge, tarnished, old. The finish largely worn away. I could still read the Forest Service emblem on it. I could not read the name or number, which had been scratched off, deliberately, with something sharp. I stood up. I looked at the structure. I looked at the ring of objects on the ground, and in the silence of that clearing, in the gray November light under the old-growth canopy, I understood, not intellectually, not analytically, but in that deep bodily way where your nervous system tells you what your brain hasn't fully processed yet. I understood that this was not an animal. Whatever it was not an animal. Animals do not construct. Animals do not maintain. Animals do not arrange objects in deliberate patterns around structures they have built. Animals do not collect ranger badges. The thing I had been building behavioral models around for 7 months. The thing I had been classifying as unknown wildlife. The thing the list on my wall described in terms that I'd been interpreting as large predator. It was not an animal. I did not run. I wanted to run. Every part of me that governed survival wanted me to run. Instead, I took my phone out and I photographed everything. Methodically, the structure from multiple angles. The object ring, the bones, the painted rocks, the badge. Then I put my phone away, and I walked back up the trail, back past the red marker, back to the station. The night of November 14th, I was inside by 5:30, all windows shut. I sat at the desk in the lantern light with my notebook open, and I wrote out everything I'd seen, every detail. I was thorough. I was focused. I was managing the fear by staying procedural. At 7 p.m. the sound began. From the east, from the direction of the clearing I had been in 9 hours earlier. It was different, semi-low tonal quality, but louder than I had ever heard it, and faster. The rhythm was faster, more urgent, like a normal language speeding up when the speaker is agitated or alarmed. It lasted 12 minutes, the longest duration I had ever recorded. When it stopped, the forest went silent. I sat at the desk and looked at the windows and the door. The door began to creak, not open. The bolts held, but the wood of the door itself began to creak in a way that wood creaks under pressure. Something was pressing against the door, not knocking, not pounding, pressing. Steadily with what must have been enormous force, because the door is 3-inch solid timber and I could see it flexing inward, flexing against the bolts, and the sound it made was the sound of wood under serious stress. I picked up the hunting knife. I stood up from the desk. The pressure held for approximately 40 seconds. Then it stopped. Then the sound again, right outside the door. 3 feet away from me, separated by 3 inches of timber. At that proximity, I could hear things in it that I had never heard from a distance. Modulation. Variation. It wasn't a single note or a repeated note. It was a pattern of notes, changing, cycling, with what sounded like intentional structure communication. Whatever was on the other side of my door was communicating. I gripped the knife. My hand was shaking. Not visibly, not big shakes, but the small continuous tremor of a body running on pure adrenaline with nowhere to put it. The sound stopped. Silence. Then footsteps. Heavy, widely spaced footsteps moving away from the door, across the clearing, into the trees. And then nothing. I did not sleep. In the morning, I found something new. On the door of the cabin, at a height of approximately 7.5 feet, something had been drawn in the soft gray weathering of the old wood. Not cut in, not gouged, but drawn. The way you draw a finger through dust, careful lines, deliberate. It was a rendering of the structure I had photographed in the clearing. The tripod shape, the conical frame, rendered accurately, with detail that would require either having seen the structure or having built it. I stood in front of the drawing on my door for a long time. It knew I had been to the clearing. It knew I had seen the structure. And it had come to my door not to attack, If it wanted to attack, I had no doubt it could have come through that door, bolts and timber notwithstanding, but to leave me a message, to confirm that it knew, to establish, in whatever its mode of communication was, that the boundary had been crossed, and that the crossing had been noticed. The question I could not answer, and still cannot answer fully, was what it meant by telling me this. Was it a warning? A territorial marker? A communication of some other kind? In a language I had no framework for interpreting. I stood in front of the drawing and I thought about the ring of objects in the clearing, the deliberate arrangement, the maintained structure, the ranger badge with the name scratched off. How many rangers had been here before me? How many had crossed the red marker? How many had found the structure and come back and found drawings on their door? December, I had made a decision. I was going to leave. Not immediately. I had responsibilities. I had a season that ran through spring. I had a professional obligation that I was not willing to simply abandon. But I was going to finish the season, and I was going to leave, and I was not going to come back. The incidents continued. The sound almost every night. The circling prints on the nights of the silence episodes. Once in early December, I woke to find the drawing on the door had been added to, a new element, what looked like a figure, bipedal, drawn below the structure with lines radiating from it that I could not interpret. I did not go back to the clearing. I did not cross the red marker again. I followed the list exactly, every night, without exception. And slowly, very slowly, the incidents began to reduce in frequency. The sound came less often. The footprints were farther from the cabin. The silence episodes stopped entirely in late December. By January, I was having whole weeks without incident. I don't know what to make of that. I've thought about it a lot. The pattern suggested that my compliance, my return to following the rules, my staying within the boundary, was meaningful to whatever was out there. That it registered. That behavior within the established parameters of that list was recognized and met with a kind of reduced pressure, and violation of the boundary was met with escalated engagement. The list wasn't just rules for our safety. The list was a protocol. A negotiated protocol, arrived at through whatever encounters had happened, with previous rangers, formalized in the only form that could be passed down. A coexistence agreement. Some owner, some ranger, some researcher, some person who had been in that cabin before me and encountered what I encountered, had worked out terms. Stay out of the east section. Don't acknowledge the sounds. Don't try to communicate. Don't cross the red marker. In exchange for compliance. Coexistence. I thought about the ranger badge, the name scratched off. The terms had not always been followed. The terms had perhaps been worked out at significant cost. The last week of my posting was late March, into April. On my second to last night at the station, the sound came at 10 p.m. from the northwest, from a new direction, one it had never used before. I closed the windows as the list required, and I sat at the desk. The sound lasted a long time, 45 minutes, the longest by far. And in those 45 minutes, I listened to it more carefully than I had ever listened before. Not trying to find a source or analyze it intellectually, but just listening. The way you listen to music when you stop trying to understand it and let it work on you. There was something in it. Something I hadn't been able to hear from a distance or when I was afraid. A quality that I can only describe. And I know how this sounds. I know exactly how it sounds. As grief. Not human grief. Not any grief I have a language for, but something in the pattern and modulation of those sounds communicated loss and age, and a kind of weight that comes from existing in a place for a very long time and watching things change around you that you cannot stop. I sat at the desk and I listened, and when it stopped, I said nothing. I didn't respond. The list said not to respond, and I followed the list, but I stayed at the window for a while after, looking out at the dark clearing and the darker tree line, and I felt something that I have never quite been able to name. Not sympathy exactly. Not understanding. Something more like recognition. The recognition you have when you encounter something so completely outside your frame of reference that the only response available to you is a kind of terrible law. Whatever was out there, it had been there before there were rangers, before there were trails, before there was a road. It would be there after I left, after the station rotted and the trails closed over and the human presence in Kessler Ridge. Temporary, incidental, a blip in the deep history of that old-growth forest. Receded. I was a guest. I had been a guest the whole time. The rules on the list were not instructions for managing wildlife. They were the terms of hospitality, extended by something ancient to something new, contingent on the new thing knowing its place. I drove out of Kessler Ridge on the 16th of April. I have not been back. A room with no windows, a man with no name. I want to tell you about that, briefly, because it is where this ends, or where it doesn't end. 2 weeks after leaving the posting, I was contacted through the district office and asked to come in for what was described as a routine exit review. It was not routine. The room was in a regional facility I won't name. The man, middle-aged, professionally dressed, nothing remarkable about him except that everything about him suggested careful neutrality, said he wanted to talk about my incident reports from the Kessler Ridge posting. He was particularly interested in my report of the crossing past the red marker. I had filed that report. I'd filed everything. He wanted a full account of what I'd seen in the clearing. I gave it to him. All of it. The structure, the object ring, the bones, the badge. I had the photographs on my phone, and I showed them to him, and he looked at each one with that same carefully neutral expression and said nothing. Then he asked me if I still had the list, the one from the wall. I said yes. He asked if I'd be willing to provide it. I said I'd think about it. He did not press. He told me, and these are his words, as close as I can render them, that the situation at Kessler Ridge had been the subject of ongoing monitoring for several decades, that the protocol established for the posting was based on extensive documentation, and that the protocol existed for good reason, that the crossing of the east boundary, while understandable given the circumstances, had created some concern, that future postings at the station would be adequately briefed. I asked him what it was. He said they didn't have a definitive answer to that question. I asked him how long they'd been monitoring. He said a long time. I asked him if anyone had been hurt. He looked at me for a moment, then he said, "Not recently, not recently." I left the room. I drove home. I put the list in the same notebook as my personal field notes, and I put the notebook in a lockbox that currently sits under my bed. I said at the beginning that I was telling this because people are still going up there. Rangers are still being posted to Kessler Ridge. Hikers are still using those trails. On weekends in summer, there are probably 20-30 people within a mile of the east boundary, sitting at their campsites, eating their trail food, telling each other stories as the light goes down. Most of them will hear nothing, or they'll hear something and explain it away. The brain is very good at explanation. It is almost as good at explanation as it is at survival, but some of them will hear the sound and feel the way I felt when I first heard it. That something is flagging in the old part of the brain. That something doesn't fit. If you are one of those people, I need you to do something for me. Go inside. Close all windows. Do not go out until it is fully light. And if you are a ranger taking that posting, if you walk into that cabin and you see a piece of paper tacked above the desk, read it immediately. Read it carefully. Read it like someone who understands that a person you've never met went through something you can barely imagine to leave it there for you. Because they did, and follow it. Every rule. Every time, not for my sake, because whatever has been living in the eastern section of Kessler Ridge for longer than the station has existed, longer than the trails, longer than the roads. Whatever it is that maintains the clearing and marks, that boundary encircles your cabin on the silent nights and presses its weight against your door and knows, with a precision that has never stopped disturbing me when it has been seen. It knows when you are following the rules, and it knows when you are not. I drove away from Kessler Ridge in April. I have not been back. I sleep better now, mostly. Some nights, in the particular silence just before 4 in the morning, I wake up and I lie there with my eyes open, and I listen. And sometimes, not every night, not often, but sometimes, in the quiet of my apartment, 30 miles from any forest, on a residential street with cars and streetlights and neighbors, I hear it. Very faint, very far away, rhythmic, tonal. I don't know if it is real. I have been thinking about that question since April. I have not come to a satisfying answer. What I know is that I close the window. Every time. Every single time. I close the window, and I lie back down, and I wait for the light.